Hi, everyone, and welcome to Dentist's Coffee Time. In our world, we're trained to be perfectionists, right? We chase after that flawless, millimeter perfect smile. But have you ever just stopped and wondered if our clinical definition of perfect is the same as what our patients actually see? Well, today we're going to dive deep into that fascinating gap between our professional ideals and what the public really perceives. We're going to look at some data that seriously challenges some of the fundamental rules we've all been taught about aesthetic dentistry. So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off by talking about our clinical obsession with perfect symmetry and the anatomical guides we've always trusted. Then we'll get into this game-changing idea of the perception threshold. What can people actually see? From there, we'll dig into the hard data on what patients really notice. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by talking about how this helps us redefine the perfect smile from a much more patient-centered view. All right, let's start with the big one, the foundational principle that has driven aesthetic dentistry for decades, this relentless, all-consuming quest for perfect balance and symmetry. And let's be honest, this isn't just some casual preference. It's the gold standard, the holy grail we've all been taught to shoot for in every single case. And the anchor for this whole concept, the North Star of the aesthetic smile, has always been the dental midline. It's been drilled into us that it has to align perfectly with the center of the face to create harmony. Any deviation, even a tiny one, is seen as a flaw that we absolutely have to correct. And this isn't just something we picked up along the way. It is deeply embedded in our textbooks and literature. This quote from 2009 really says it all. It claims that symmetry literally determines the success of our treatment. Think about that for a second. Not just contributes to success, but determines it. That is an incredibly high bar we've been setting for ourselves and for our work. But this whole pursuit of a perfect midline immediately brings up a huge question. How do we actually find the true center of the face? I mean, if our entire aesthetic framework is balancing on this one single line, our ability to locate it has to be foolproof. It has to be reliable, right? For years, the go-to reference has been the interpupillary line. The logic seems so elegant, so simple. You just draw a line between the center of the pupils, find the exact middle of that line, and drop another line straight down, perpendicular to it. And voila, that should be your facial midline, at least in theory. It sounds great on paper, almost like a geometric proof. But as clinicians, we have to ask the tough questions. Does this theoretical guide actually line up with the reality of our patients' faces? Well, some researchers decided to put this very fundamental assumption to the test. This brings us back to that really important study out of Brazil by Eskilsson's team. They took 102 dental students and very precisely measured the relationship between the midline they got from the interpupillary line and the actual maxillary dental midline. It was a direct, head-to-head test of our classic technique. And the result was, well, kind of a bombshell. They found no statistically significant correlation between the two. None. That trusted anatomical landmark that we've relied on for so long, it doesn't consistently predict where the dental midline is or where it should be. The map we've been using for generations, turns out, it's flawed. This discovery really opens up a whole new can of worms. If finding the perfect center is so tricky, and if we know that natural variation is just the norm, then does a minor imperfection even matter? In other words, if a smile isn't perfectly symmetrical by our clinical standards, can people even tell? To answer that, we've got to talk about a truly landmark study from 1999 by Dr. Vincent Kokich and his team. Their method was just brilliant. They took a photo of an attractive smile, and then, using early digital tools, they systematically introduced common flaws. They'd create a series of images for each flaw, starting with 0 error, and then just cranking it up in tiny little increments. Then they showed all these images to 3 groups, orthodontists, general dentists, and regular people, to pinpoint the exact moment a flaw goes from invisible to noticeably unattractive. Okay, now let's get into the data from that study. And I'm telling you, the results are not just fascinating. For a lot of us, they are genuinely practice-changing. This is where our clinical assumptions get put to the ultimate test against the reality of human perception. So prepare to be surprised. So let's start with the one we obsess over, the maxillary dental midline. Based on what we now know, that our anatomical guides aren't really reliable, how much of a deviation do you actually think people can detect? Half a millimeter? 1, 2, what's your guess? So take a look at this comparison from the study.
On the left, you've got a perfectly centered midline. Now, look at the image on the right. That midline has been shifted a full 4 millimeters. Now be honest, if you just saw that image on the right by itself, would that 4 millimeter flaw immediately jump out at you as unattractive?
This is where the data gets remarkable. The only group that could reliably detect a midline deviation was the orthodontists, the most highly trained specialists in this area. And even they didn't consistently spot it until it was a massive 4 millimeter shift. For both general dentists and for laypeople, a 4 millimeter deviation was statistically non-detectable. They just couldn't see it.
This is really the core finding. Let that sink in for just a moment. A 4 millimeter midline shift, an amount we would consider a pretty significant clinical problem, maybe one that needs complex treatment, goes completely unnoticed by most people, and that includes our own dental colleagues.
Okay, so a horizontal side-to-side shift isn't very noticeable. But what about a different kind of asymmetry? What happens when we introduce a cant, a slight vertical tilt, to the entire incisal plane?
Well, the difference in perception here is just dramatic. While a huge 4 millimeter horizontal shift gets missed, a tiny 1 millimeter incisal cant was easily spotted by both orthodontists and general dentists. And by the time that cant reached just 2 millimeters, laypeople found it significantly unattractive. It seems the human eye is incredibly sensitive to vertical tilts, probably because our brains are hardwired to look for horizontal lines, like the horizon, for balance. A small tilt is just way more jarring to our senses than a large shift.
The study also looked into gingival display, and it revealed another huge perception gap. Orthodontists, being the most critical group, rated a smile as less aesthetic once the gingival display went past 2 millimeters. But patients? They were perfectly happy all the way until it hit a full 4 millimeters. They have double the tolerance for a gummy smile than specialists do, which really highlights this major disconnect between our clinical standards and actual patient satisfaction.
So what does all of this mean for us? It means that those rigid, millimeter-perfect rules we've held so dear, they just don't seem to line up with the reality of human perception. Now, this data isn't telling us to abandon our pursuit of excellence, not at all. Instead, it's inviting us to redefine our goal. We should probably move from chasing absolute numbers to managing what is actually perceived by the patient. So here are the key takeaways. Our clinical focus really needs to shift. Instead of pouring immense effort, time, and patient resources into correcting a 2 millimeter midline shift that nobody sees, our energy is so much better spent fixing the 1 millimeter incisal cant that everyone notices. We have to recognize that a patient's idea of harmony is often far more tolerant than our own highly trained eyes, and our treatment plans really ought to reflect that reality. And the researchers themselves concluded their landmark paper with this very same thought. They challenged the entire profession to ask, is it really necessary to correct subtle variations if they're completely invisible to the average patient? It's such a powerful question, and it puts the patient's experience and their perception right at the center of our aesthetic philosophy, where it belongs. And that leads us to our final thought for you. Knowing what you know now, that a patient might not even see a 3 millimeter midline discrepancy, but will definitely notice a 2 millimeter incisal cant, how does that change the conversation you have in your office? How might this influence the way you present treatment options and manage your patients' expectations? We would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments section below.
Thanks so much for watching. This is Dentist Coffee Time. Bye!